Hi everyone, in this video I am going to have a discussion a little bit using a few basic figures about Islamism, globalization. That's the main theme. But what I wanted to do, as I was reading your work, your answers to my questions, I noticed quite a lot of you were answering the question, well, Islamism isn't against globalization, it's against westernization. I think a lot of your assumptions, part of the assumption behind that, Islamism isn't against globalization, it's against westernization, is the idea that westernization involves secularization, right? So westernization as secularization. And I thought we'll have a look at, do those two things go together, westernization and secularization, right? And then what if anything, does westernization or secularization have on globalization in the context of sort of Islamism. And I thought we'd start here in Turkey, where we get a look at some figures of the Turkish education system and how religious it is, right? How religious is religious education in Turkey, or how religious is education in Turkey, and what sort of trends are we seeing there, right? I think this class is still called Global Trends, right? So we'll look at this, Turkish trends. Right? So have a look at this. We'll see that this is the number of schools basically over since 2008, and the last year that we have data for here is 2017, so 3 years ago. But we see definitely two big things, right? One, we see that before 2013 there were no middle schools that were religious. Right? And this type of Imam Hatib schools, they are schools where religious education lessons account for 1/4 to 1/3 of curriculum on average. And as the blurb at the top there continues, it's increased sharply. The number of schools has increased sharply since 2012, and we have middle schools for the first time in 2013. And so we see roughly, right, it's only upper schools in 2008, and there's about 456 of them. By 2017, we have 2,671 middle schools and 1,452 upper schools. That on its own, it's an absolute value. It's interesting. It shows that we're opening many more religious schools in Turkey. It shows the spread down into middle school of religious schools, but it doesn't tell us the proportion of students, for example, are attending these schools. But we see that on the next slide here. We see that upper schools, right, we had about 4% in 2008. 4% of Turkish students attended, 4% of upper school students in Turkey attended religious schools. That by 2015 went up to almost 12% in upper school, and sort of retracted a little bit after down to 2017, but still it's almost 3 times what it was in 2008. And then we see middle schools, right, that start, remember, in 2013. At first it's 1.7%, but that sharply climbs to about 12%. So now we see about 12% of Turkish students, school students, both in middle school and in upper school, are attending religious schools where 1/4 to 1/3 of their curriculum is religious instruction. And that's all we're really seeing now, right? We're not seeing really, we can't really surmise from this whether or not Islamism is against globalization. Certainly not. Can we say that Islamism is against secularization? Well, we probably can say that before we look at the figures, right? Because we can, it's almost a definitional thing, right? You can't be both an Islamist and a secularist, right? And if you're one, you're probably not the other. You're almost certainly not the other, right? You can't be both an Islamist and a secularist, right? Somebody that believes that Islamic laws, Islamic rules should be followed in society, should form a basis for national laws, right, and national customs, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, also believe that religion shouldn't play a part in customs and laws, national laws, so governmental government, right? So they probably have to be, right, which is I suppose why many of you might have went that direction in your answers, because you're on quite a sure foundation, which is good. If though we view Turkey, as I suggested earlier on in the video, if we do view Turkey as a battleground, right, between these two forces of secularism and Islamism, then we see that religious education, right, Islamism, right, which Islamism, a part of it would have to probably be, right, if we're going to establish a society based on the tenets of Islam, education is going to be important to that, right? So how we instruct our children, they're going to have to understand what the tenets of Islamism are, if we're going to have a society based on it, and what better place than in school to teach that. So, but on the other hand, so we see a big movement towards religious schools, but of course, even at the peak, right, we're only at about 12% of students, right? 12% of students who are attending religious schools that have that level of religious instruction. So, but if we're looking at a backlash, a religious backlash against secularism, which is, then we are seeing some movement in Turkey, which is interesting. Here we go, government spending per upper school student. And so these are the different, you know, regular upper school, you're getting less per student, right? You're getting almost twice as much per student in religious schools. So that shows a government priority, right, in terms of where they see the future, what they prioritize in terms of education. Now, though, if we transition a little bit from talking about Islamism versus secularism in Turkey, and we stay with Turkey, but we say, well, is this anti-Western, right? Is this a backlash against Westernism, as many of you said, right? Is there evidence here of a backlash against Westernism? The only way we can really answer yes to that, based on our discussion so far, is to equate Westernism, Westernization, with secularization. Right? And so let's have a look at that a little bit. What I've done here, I found this Pew Research Center thing from 2000, I think it's published in 2018, there you go. But I think the surveys only got to 2017, but that's fine. And what I've got is, I've got a map of the world, and I'm looking at it, and I'm trying to decide, where is religion important? If Westernization equals secularization, then what I want to see, I think, to confirm that, here, just with these, and I've got 4 charts, I think, that are going to, not all of them are going to speak to that, but some of them will. Then we should expect to see in the West that religion is not so important. And perhaps also what we want to see is that in the West, religion is not important to people, but also in other parts of the world, it is important to people, unless you were going to argue that Westernization has already taken place, right? So, and let's discuss that in a little bit more detail here. But let's start with the basics. Let's look at where's the West, right? So if we follow Samuel P. Huntington, which I think is fair to do, right? Then we've got sort of most of this part of Europe here, Western and Northern Europe, basically. Even Northeastern Europe is going to be considered Western. Certainly they're all NATO members, which is one indication, but for Huntington, it's about religion, right? They're all belonged historically to the Western Church, right? To the Catholic Church, and then the Protestant churches that came from the Catholic Church, right? They all were heavily influenced by those. In other words, not Orthodox Christians, basically. So that part of Europe there, which is quite a lot of Europe, and then North America, right? The societies that broke off from those Western European countries, mostly Britain, I guess, when I'm talking about Canada and the US, and then Australia and New Zealand down here. And we see, if we look at them, we see something. Well, certainly if we start here in Europe, we see UK 10%. 10% of people in the UK say religion is very important. Quite secular. 90% are saying it's not very important in their lives. Similar numbers, well, the same number, I guess, with Germany, and very close with France. Spain is a little bit more religious. But now look at Greece, right? Greece for Samuel P. Huntington, actually Greece is in the Orthodox civilization, right, which is not in the West. But it's difficult to say once and for all, Greece is not a Western country. It's in the EU. It is part of NATO. It is oftentimes sort of viewed as the sort of cradle of Western civilization. What else? Its independence, right, in the 19th century, the sort of early to mid 19th century, was aided by the French and the British chiefly. They modeled themselves on the French Revolution. So heavily Western influenced, and also heavily influenced of the West, ancient, in terms of ancient Greek civilization. It's hard to completely push them outside of the West, but there they are with 56%. Of people saying that religion is very important. I think even more puzzling than Greece is the United States. In the United States, which for Huntington is the core of Western civilization, right? The core country, 53%. So we still have a majority of people saying that religion is very important in their lives, which is a clear, other than Greece, right, which is again questionable, at least for Huntington, right, whether they're in the West or not. But other than Greece, the United States is the only place where a majority of people say religion is very important to them. And it's stunningly different from, let's say, the UK, where 10%, right? It's 5 times as many people in the United States, right? And again, a majority of people, even more than twice as much as Spain, for example. So we have already, if we're going to talk about Westernization as secularization, then we have to account for the United States. The core of the West is a country where the majority of people say religion is very important. Now, what we can do with that is we can say, well, perhaps secularization, Westernization isn't about, well, you have to say that the United States population is not Westernized, right? Which would be, if Westernization equals secularization, then you say, well, the United States is not really Westernized, which becomes a very difficult sort of counterintuitive argument to make, right? It's a very, you're going to have very strong opposition if you say that, right? Because it's almost the definition of Westernization, right? So that's one thing that this throws up that I think is interesting. That, do we mean Europeanization, right? We could talk about Europeanization as secularization all day, right? We'd have to explain Greece a little bit, but Greece is always on the very extreme of Europe, so we could maybe explain that away. But we can't say Westernization if we want to include the US in the West, or to say that it is Westernized. The other thing that's interesting, right, is that we would have to say, well, where else do we see a lot of secularism? China, right? 3% say it's very important in China. I think that's the lowest number that I can see on here, 3%. Japan, 10%, which is the same as the UK and Sweden, very low. Russia, 16%, still in the same ballpark, certainly less than Spain. Australia, which we already said is part of the West, okay, and Canada, right there, quite low as well. And so, but we have to say, well, China's become, if we're going to equate secularization with Westernization, we have to say, well, China's become very Westernized. It's certainly secularized, right? So if we're going to equate the two, if we're going to say, well, look, they are secular for another reason, right? They're secularized for a different reason. They're not Westernized, they're secularized. Now we've split secularization away from Westernization a little bit. And so, now if we talk about Islamism versus Westernization, which Samuel P. Huntington wants to do quite a lot, then if we're going to do that, then it becomes slightly harder, I think, to do that in terms of secularism, because we say, well, why are we saying that they're Westernized? Why aren't we saying that they're Sinicized, right? Why haven't they become Sinicized? I think is the best way I can put. Chineseified, I don't know. We don't use that. We don't talk about that as much as Westernization, so I'm not sure what that means, how to say that properly. But why aren't we saying that? Right? Why are we assuming it's the West that's secularizing them, and not the same thing that secularized China, right? Or Japan, which we wouldn't say that Japan is Westernized. I don't think we might. Russia, would we also say, Samuel P. Huntington wants to separate these civilizations, right? So he would say China is one, Japan is one, Russia is part of the Orthodox civilization, the one that includes Greece and Ukraine and Belarus, these eastern countries, and Serbia as well down here, Bulgaria, Orthodox countries in Eastern Europe with Russia. So yeah. The thing that we do notice from this map is that if we're looking at places where religion is important to people, we can see that it's oftentimes the global south, right? So Brazil, which would be Christian, most predominantly Christian country, 72% say it's very important to them. We've got Peru here, right? Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador in there, some central Honduras is at 90%, right? So we've got Latin American countries where religion is very important to them, so global south again. We've got African countries, a lot of which will be predominantly Christian, although there'll be sizable Muslim populations in some of these countries. Egypt, of course, would be predominantly Islamic country, 72%. Then we've got the Middle East, we've got Iraq there, is very bright. There's no number there, but it's between 80 and 100% according to the key. We've got Turkey, which is like 68%. We've got Iran, 78%. Pakistan, 94%. Afghanistan, these are Islamic, predominantly Islamic countries. India, which has a large Islamic minority, but is more Hindu and some Christian, 80%. And then Indonesia, of course, the biggest Muslim country in the world, 93%. So we see now the global south and very oftentimes Islamic countries, although not all Islamic countries. There's Albania here and Bosnia are quite light colored there too. So they don't have very high, they're not saying religion is very important in their lives. Let's go to the next one really quickly. Rates of daily prayer. This is another measure, but it says pretty much the same thing, right? How often do you pray? You would expect those two things to be correlated. If you say religion is very important, you're probably praying in one way or another every day, and so you see basically the same lesson there. This is an interesting map because we're talking about Islamism. This is talking about Muslims, about adherence to Islam. And so it's looking at Muslims throughout, because what you could do, right, is you could say, there's something about perhaps Christianity, right, because you still have trouble explaining China and Japan, right, but all the other countries, the European countries, Russia, Canada, Australia, where it's traditionally predominantly Christian, you could say, well, maybe there's something about Christianity that causes secularism or something like that. Secularism seems to have taken hold mostly in Christian countries. And so now what we're looking at is, well, let's just look at one religion, right? Let's look at Muslims around the world, and let's see where religion is important to Muslims and where it's not. And one idea, if we want to equate Westernization with secularization, is that if you live in the West, right, the West is the most Westernized place. Of course, it has to be, by definition. So if we live in the West, and if you're a Muslim, does that reduce the amount of the importance of religion in your life? Do you become secularized if you live in the West? That might equate Westernization and secularization. And so let's have a look. We see France, right, which would be certainly part of the West, where 54% of Muslims say that religion is very important in their lives. It's more than half. But of course, it's less than in Ghana. Muslims, 97% in Ghana, 94% in Nigeria. Let's see, in India, 85% of Muslims, 94% of Muslims in Pakistan say it's very important, 75% of Muslims in Egypt. That's going to be about the same as last time. Iraq, 83%. Israel, right, is Israel in the West or not? The United States is 66%. Right, so again, we've got a good majority, right, 2/3 of the Muslims living in the United States say religion is very important in their lives. In Russia, it's 43%, which is less than half, but it's still, Russia's quite a secular country. What was it, 18% on the last slide that we looked at? So that should give you some what does it tell us about the West, Westernization? If we look at Albania, Albania is 15% of Muslims in Albania, and Albania is a predominantly Muslim country. 15% of Muslims in Albania say that it's very important in their lives, right? Not very high, but then it would be hard to sort of talk about Albania in the West, although it's probably on the borderlands there. Russia 43%, but no, I don't know if this is telling us very much about the West and secularization. Certainly, Muslims in the United States are still 2/3 of them are religious, but that's not as high, I suppose, as Kenya, where 95% of them say it's very important, or Indonesia, where 93% of them say it's very important. But it's more than Russia, right? So if you're saying Westernization is secularization, well then Russia's secularization, but not Westernized, right? So there's that. This is weekly attendance, right? This should probably confirm our hypothesis. Who's going to church or to the mosque or to the temple every week? Well, the United States, although 55% of people say it's important, right? Only 36% of people actually go every week, once a week. The United Kingdom, 10% say it's important, but 8% go every week. Very low, single digits here. Sweden 6%, Russia 7%, China 1%. So yeah, so that's the question I've been trying to answer here, right? Is really lots of you, when you talk about Islamism, you I think rightly talked and sort of on firm foundations talked about Islamism versus secularism, which have to be enemies. Really, you can't have both of those things. At least not both of them in harmony with one another. One side is going to want to push the other side out. But can we equate that to Westernization? And then can we equate it to globalization, right, which is the next big step? This is a question about a backlash against globalization. This class asks that question about a backlash against globalization. And so I think we're left with two possible models here of globalization. One where globalization just means Westernization. And then if we tag on secularization to Westernization, we say, okay, China, Russia, they become Westernized, right? We equate the two. They certainly become secularized. I think we also say Islamic countries are perhaps the least secularized if we don't take into account Albania. Right, they're the least secularized probably on here. And so then you do get that clash that you've been pointing out. But, and somebody did mention this, if we go back to the jihad versus McWeld model, and be careful with jihad and Islamism, right? Because of course, what Benjamin Barr was talking about isn't really jihad in an Islamic sense. He's taken that, but he's using it as a metaphor, right? For all local identities, right? Local identities that are fighting against a global identity, or lack of identity, this disconnection from identity. So, but this jihad versus well, again, one of the things I like about it is that they're both qualities of globalization, and yes, they have to be clashing. We've already said that a couple of times. They have to be dissonant. Islamism and secularism, you know, Christianism and secularism. Right? Any religion and secularism have to clash, right? Because it's they're opposites. But can they nevertheless both be elements of globalization, right? And then we get a globalization that's dissonant inside of itself. It's not internally consistent. It involves Islamism. Globalization has Islamism and it has secularism. Both of them, and yes, they clash. And globalization is about bringing that clash and other clashes to the foreground. My only sort of hesitancy or sort of remark about that is, if we're going to have that, if we're going to have globalization as just a large cacophony, right, a non-harmonious coexistence of lots of different, sort of the jihad model of Benjamin Barber, right, of lots of dissonant and differing and conflicting ideologies and political movements, then does it lose its meaning a little bit? Right? Because of course these things have already existed. Secularism has existed. Islamism has existed for a long time. Are we seeing anything new or anything different with globalization? And if not, what's the backlash against? Right? If we want to say that Islamism is a backlash against globalization, or if we want to say Trumpism is a backlash against globalization, well, what's it really a backlash against? Is it a backlash against the coexistence of these things? Right, and an attempt to resolve them one way or another. Is globalization an attempt to solve these clashes? But no, because we already defined it as a coexistence alongside of each other. So is the backlash against it an attempt to resolve it? An attempt to resolve the clash, an attempt to resolve the contradictions, right, between secularism and Islamism, or secularism and religion generally, any other religion, or between local and global, or between protecting our manufacturing base and trading with the world. Right? These things seem like they're in a necessary conflict with one another. Globalization is maybe the acceptance that yes, these all exist, and yes, they're in conflict with each other, and we have to live in that conflict, and we have to accept that conflict and allow that conflict to continue. And then by this model, we'd have like a backlash against globalization, which is, no, we've got to solve it one way or another. We've got to solve it. If you're Trump, we've got to solve the question of economics in favor of America first, American manufacturing over trade with the rest of the world. We're going to settle it once and for all. Or indeed, like perhaps even the neoliberals, no, we're going to solve it the other way. We're going to solve it in, yes, people are going to go bankrupt here in the United States, people are going to lose their jobs, but that's okay, because overall we're going to gain from global trade. Right? We're going to solve it one way or the other. And globalization is sort of the opposite of all of those. It's the of all of those attempts to solve it. Anyway, that's sort of where these figures and where thinking about this took me in terms of a theory of what globalization might be. And so I hope that was a little bit novel for you, perhaps something to think about perhaps in your writing. But I hope as well that you've seen sort of the influence of taking some basic numbers that you found on the internet or at the Pew Research Center, and sort of trying to help them inform what you think about the questions that I'm asking, right? Both in the instructor's question, but mostly I'm thinking about your paper that you're going to write. You're going to answer these types of questions, and how can you allow sort of these sorts of numbers to inform that those sorts of questions.